Hi, welcome back. This is the first part of our Central Asia module. So this module, I'm trying to think, I'd have to go back and look at the syllabus, sorry. This module is slightly shorter. So when I cover this in class, if we were actually an on-campus class, we would tend to cover this in about 2 lectures rather than 3. So you'll notice this lecture will probably only have about 2 parts. Okay, so this region, most of you probably aren't familiar with many of the countries in this region, except for probably Afghanistan. You've probably heard of Mongolia. And then this is what we generally refer to as the stands, a lot of people would. So you've got Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, which is slightly different, and then Mongolia, and then also what we refer to as Tibet, which we'll talk when we get to the geopolitics. We'll talk a little bit about some of these particular regions as well. Okay, there we go. Sorry. So here again, our basic learning objectives. So you have a summary, a reference later. Some of the key concepts we're going to talk about this unit. Some of them like pastoralist and transhumans we already talked about, but we'll cover again. So some of the general characteristics for this region. This region is the only landlocked world region. And again, this is the regions, as we've talked about, the regions according to your book. We'll talk about why these countries are together, because they can be, a lot of people, when we talk about Afghanistan, you might think, well, why wasn't Afghanistan with the Middle East? Some of these countries, well, why aren't they part of the Russian domain? Because I think it's about 5 of these countries are former Soviet republics. So we'll get into that a little bit here. And your book does a pretty good job of explaining why they define these regions particularly together instead of being separate. So this region particularly has deep historical bonds and similar environmental and economic conditions. So that's a bit more of the underlying condition in this, or an underlying factor for this region. So we're looking a little bit more about the environmental and economic conditions. This region is primarily the home of the Silk Road, which we talked about briefly when we talked about globalization and the history of globalization. It's not a new concept. The Silk Road, I want to say it's about 5,000 years old, if I'm not mistaken, roughly. And it was one of the first land-based trade routes that went from basically China to Europe. I want to say it's also like 3,000 or 5,000 miles. It's quite a long ways. You occasionally hear, I've read books about people hiking the Silk Road. But again, it now cuts through what is like Iraq and Syria areas of conflict. So this region has 5 former Soviet republics. It also includes Mongolia, which politically speaking has, and even historically with its political ties, is more associated with more associated with China and East Asia. But from a regional perspective, it's included in this region, and I think as you read through your chapter to understand a little bit more. Afghanistan we mentioned as well, and then autonomous regions of Western China, which are including Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, Tibet and Xinjiang, by being autonomous regions, they're technically part of China. Your book does a good job of describing this, and we'll talk about this when we get to the geopolitical section a little bit more. But they're regions that are very distinct from like predominant Han Chinese, other provinces, but they're not really that autonomous. So here we've got Central Asia. Here you can see, so you get a little reference, China, India, Pakistan, Iran. Russia is up here, so Russia borders the northern border for this region. So we've got Mongolia. Down here we have, so here's the Tibetan Plateau. Nepal is down here. We've got, what do we have here? Sorry, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Over here we talked about some of the regions from last week. We've got Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, which we talked about. For the Russian domain, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then Afghanistan down here. So climate for this region. Again, the fact that this is a landlocked region it makes a huge difference. So you're not getting any maritime climate. It's continental climate factors predominantly here. It's a very mountainous region. So this is the same. I don't know if you're aware about how mountains are formed. This is actually pretty sure I asked on your test. So we've talked about subduction zones, especially when we talked about North America. Remember, we talked about two different plates, and one of the plates is basically moving as they're moving. One is moving into the other. But by being subduction, one plate is going under the other plate, and then that plate eventually, the crust eventually melts and then forms, comes back up as a subduction zone volcano. What we would see, like the Andes mountain ranges, the Cascade mountain ranges on the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and which goes up through Canada. So now this is a convergence zone where the plates meet, but they push up. So the Himalayas were actually formed this way. If I'm not mistaken, Mount Shasta in California, I can't think of that specific mountain range, but they were also formed that way. So this is basically two plates that have collided and then pushed up rather than one being pushed down below the other ones. So this region is very mountainous, has high elevations. If you think Mount Everest, it's not the only mountain that is that high. And the elevation is actually a huge factor in this region about where people can live. So the Himalayas and these mountain regions also are going to strongly influence the climate as well. Steppes refers to high grasslands, which again are generally very arid. And then again, this region is very dry. So you can look here, wet climates. Let's try to ask people, ask my students, can you find the one little wet climate? It's all the way down here. There's one little point. Whether or not we can put that on here. It doesn't seem very fair, but there technically is a wet climate. As you can see, most of them are dry climates, very little rainfall. So if you go back and look at this, the red lines are showing us temperature, and then we're seeing the rainfall. So you can see throughout this region, for the most part, this is Lhasa down here. But you can see, generally speaking, the rainfall is quite low. And that is actually, if you look, that looks like it's in inches. So a lot of these countries, so up here is, so you can kind of get some perspective on how to read this. This would be 5 inches. So January, February, March, April, right throughout the year. So most months don't even see anywhere near 5 inches of rainfall. It's actually questionable whether or not a lot of these regions could even get up to, this one obviously does get about 2.5. But some of these other areas, whether or not they're even reaching 5, especially here, whether or not they even reach 5 inches of rain a year, which makes it a desert. Desert, I believe the official biological distinction is get less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. Okay, so some of the physical characteristics of this region. Again, we talked about high mountains, but a part of high mountains is having highlands. And the valleys are also quite high. I think a lot of times, especially if you're from the United States, or even Europe, you're not used to having, unless you're from maybe the Rockies, where you can actually have cities around 5,000 feet. Denver, I believe, is they call it the Mile High City, which is right about a mile above sea level. But we're talking about even higher. So if you're in the Andes, for example, where you have mountains that are over 20,000 feet tall, you can find a lot of cities that are between 8,000 to 12,000 feet tall. I believe the highest one is actually in Bolivia. La Paz, I believe, is about 14,000 feet tall, which, for general reference, if most of you don't know, 14,000 feet is about the highest elevation that humans should go before they should start considering having oxygen, and like actual oxygen tanks. So we have a lot of mountain ranges that are around this area. And then you get these high plateau areas. So these valleys might very easily be at 10,000 feet or more. So with that, we get these plains and these basins, again, which are also in very high elevations, most of them. And we get this area that they're referred to like a central belt of deserts, which is this long system of deserts. And then this northern system. So here's the a picture from the Tibetan Plateau, but you can see this steppe, we call it. So this grassland, this expansive grassland, it's very dry. It's a high elevations. So environmental geography, some of the issues that we're going to talk about. We've got the Aral Sea, which I've got a couple videos I'm going to have you watch. There's only, if I'm not mistaken, there's only 2 rivers that actually flow into the river, but the rivers have been extensively dammed and used for irrigation. So over the last 50, 60, 70, even I think about 80 years, they've been heavily irrigated. So the water is not even getting to the sea. We call these seas as well as Caspian Sea, but technically they're lakes. They're completely landlocked. What you will, is what we're seeing is that the water is not getting to the lakes. And then this has caused a wealth of other issues that I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. We've got up here a lot of soil erosion. These are not very fertile soils, and they have been used, they were seen as being very virgin lands, as they're called, the Virgin Land Campaign, which was part of the Soviet Union. So they were used for agricultural purposes, but because they weren't fertile, this quickly led to a lot of erosion issues. And then we have desertification, especially over in this area, and we'll talk about salinization as well, the same thing we saw when we talked about the Middle East region. But expansion of desert, desertification we call it, and there's been some attempts to combat this, especially in northern China area and Mongolia. Some projects have been actually quite successful, and other projects have miserably failed. So first I'm going to talk about desertification. There's been issues with shrinking lakes and attempts to expand the lakes. I want you to take a minute here, stop and go watch this YouTube video about desertification, and then we'll come back and keep talking. So a lot of the issues that we've seen in this region and what has contributed to has contributed to these threatened lakes, and whether or not there's a continued future for these lakes is the construction of dams. We talked about water conflicts and water politics, especially when we talked about Northern Africa region. We're seeing similar issues here. So there's a lot of issues so right now Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan control about 80% of the fresh water. Both are building massive dams to further control the water. This is something in a very water scarce region, and countries want to ensure their access to water, but this causes a lot of problems and a lot of threat for rivers or for countries that are downstream of these rivers. So a lot of downriver countries are fearing that they will be over-regulated, or there will be under-regulation, I should say, regarding the access of water, their rights to water as well. And there have been a lot of international attempts to try and get different agreements to be reached, but so far no agreements have been made. So here's the Aral Sea. Your book is not going to talk about this too much because your book does a really good talking about this. And I also found a couple of quick videos here that gives you a much better idea of what's going on. You can actually see. So you can see the progression of the sea. Now, the white spots are salt. In some images that you can see, they actually look black. And this is the reflection of the, like the sun, the albedo from that. So we've seen since about the 1960s about a 90% reduction. So this is like earlier images, and this is what we see today. We've seen about a 90% reduction in the size and the water content since the 1960s. This has led to severe economic damage. So as the water hasn't been flowing in because it's been taken out of the rivers for irrigation purposes, as the fresh water hasn't continued to flow into the lakes, that's created higher rates of salinization. So the salt content of the river or of the lakes has gone drastically up. But there was actually a huge fisheries industry here. So the fishing industry, you've got pretty much freshwater fish now living in saltwater. That's going to cause ecological destruction wherever, and that has then had economic impacts. So we're talking about, again, major environmental destruction. This is a natural habitat, or was, I really should say. It's hard to look at the image on the right and say it was. There's really not much left. So go ahead and stop the lecture here. take a few minutes to watch these videos. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep talking about population, and then we'll stop and do part 2. So this region is very largely sparsely populated. And again, as we've seen with some other regions, especially that are water scarce, people live where there is water. But even then, the land can't really support high density populations. So large areas are just pretty much too arid, or as we talked about with mountains and elevation being a huge factor regarding human settlement, the areas are just too high to support very much human life at all. So here's a population density map. You can see just for expansive, the very light color yellow is you have less than 6 people per square kilometer. So the majority of this region is just not densely populated. And even in the regions that are darker in color, generally speaking, the population density is still pretty low. So this just is not a densely populated area. Again, we're looking at high elevations or too arid of regions for people to live. And, again, you could consider, even if we're talking about very arid regions, imagine the ecological and economic costs of importing water or finding ways to extract water or create water. This region it exemplifies that we can't live everywhere. Humans cannot live all over the world. So this region is largely characterized by a low land population and then patterns of subsistence. So largely where we see people is where mountains meet the basins and the plains, where water supplies are adequate and soils are not salty nor alkaline, meaning that you can actually grow things on the soil. And where people largely are located in these areas that we call alluvial fans. There are questions on your exam about alluvial fans. So I put a picture. This is actually, I want to say it's from Kazakhstan. Sorry. It's a NASA satellite image. I believe your book actually has, yes, your book does have the same picture. So it's in Kazakhstan. So an alluvial fan, I always think of when I talk about hear alluvial fans, I think of the Mississippi. So this is a river coming down here, and basically what it does is as the river goes, there's probably different types of years that it floods, so there's a lot of runoff. But there's soil sediment deposits, and it comes out in this fan, which is why we call it an alluvial fan. It's a fan shape. So you can see because of the deposits that are coming from this river, so the nutrients and the minerals that are being provided by the sediments provided from the river, it creates actually very fertile sands. And then we also have this region, I believe there might be an exam question as well. This is something, this loess soils that continually pops up even when we talk about our next unit for Eastern Eastern Europe. Oh, I am so sorry. I apparently need some more coffee. For Eastern Asia. So loess is a very fertile, silty soil, and it's usually deposited by wind. So until the 20th century, almost none of this area had ever been plowed and farmed. It was grasslands, and people did not try to do large-scale agriculture. And then again, we're talking about former Soviet republics, and it was largely in these countries that farming began to happen in about the 1950s. So this is a very good picture to kind of show you as well about where people are located. So each red dot is about 5,000 people. So you can see here we have mountains. Elevation is too high in the mountain regions, so people can't live there. This is desert. There's virtually no water. People literally just can't live there. So it's here along these plains where the elevation comes down and there's water. So water comes down off of the mountains, which explains how they're getting water, that you start to see populations. So to give you an example, this dark region is 4,000 plus meters. So 4 times 3, we're looking at areas that are 12,000 feet or more. It's a rough calculation. So even down here where we see some of these dots are in the lighter brown colors. So what is these colors now? So this darker area here is about 12,000 feet. So this darker area here is 12,000 feet. So this is even higher than that. So you can see this still goes up to 12,000 feet. So this area here would still be up to 12,000 feet. So this area here is a little bit less. So some of the population issues, we see a huge disparity in population from one country to the next. So again, as we talked about, relatively low density throughout. However, some areas are starting to grow much more rapidly than they have in the past. Western China and Tibet are both examples of population growth, but this is a population growth largely from Han immigration. Han is the predominant ethnic group within China, Eastern China, so they're moving to these Western areas. The former Soviet countries were seeing largely outward migration, especially since 1991, which, if you remember from last week, was the fall of the Soviet Union. First, we mostly saw Russians leaving, so reverse Russification, if you remember, and then workers leaving as well. There's some countries, Tajikistan, for example, where I think it's close to 50% of the country's earnings are actually remittances that are sent back from Tajiks living in other countries, predominantly Russia. And so then we see fertility rates ranging largely from one country to other. So on the right, we see Azerbaijan, which there's a bit of a baby bust right now. It looks like maybe a little bit of a boom. Whereas Afghanistan, we have a very traditional pyramid, which represents a high rates of population growth. So what we're seeing for a lot of this region, especially more in the highland areas, is nomadic pastoralism, which we talked about from a couple of units ago when we started talking about sub-Saharan Africa. So these are people who raise livestock for subsistence purposes. The primary livestock for this region is actually the yak. And then there's also transhumance, which we have down here. So transhumance is nomadic pastoralism, but the difference is that you're not just moving your livestock from one region to another, you're moving them from elevations, so from low to high elevations, depending on the time of the year. Farming is also possible in some areas, specifically in Tibet. A lot of the population depends on farming, agriculture, subsistence agriculture, but it's really only possible in a few locations. And again, this is related to altitude. So some of the population indicators for this region, you can see the population varies quite drastically from one to the next. Mongolia only has 2.9 people. Kyrgyzstan has 5.7. And then you get Uzbekistan, which is close to 30, and Afghanistan, which is over 30. So population density, again, is drastically different. Mongolia, 2 people per square kilometer, to Azerbaijan with over 100 people per square kilometer. Rates of natural increase. So remember, rate of natural increase to actually supply, like continue to supply the population and maintain it where it is at 2.1. So some of these countries is much lower at 1.3 with Azerbaijan. And then at the most, you have Afghanistan with 2.8. So that is representing population growth. Again, total fertility rates can drastically different. No surprise here with Afghanistan at 6.2. Percent urban. Pretty low compared to the rest of the world. We do have a couple countries that are about 50%, Mongolia, which is slightly larger, but again, relatively low. Afghanistan, only 23%. Percent of the population under the age of 15, especially with Afghanistan, 46% is quite high. And then again, the percent of the population over 65 is quite low. And then net migration, so a lot of people leaving these countries. Kyrgyzstan was 6.4%, so Tajikistan was 7%, so a lot of people leaving to look for work in other countries. Let me just wrap up here quickly with urbanization. So we talk about this not being an urban area, the low rates of urbanization, but the river valleys of this region have been partially urbanized with human settlements for thousands of years. So it's not a new concept. It's just not a huge concept. And then a lot of the cities are, so you hear, we have a picture of traditional architecture, and then down below you see Kazakhstan, which has a much more modern architecture. So you see a huge contrast here between very lavish architecture historically. You have a strong Soviet influence, and then you have an emerging modern design in cities as well. Okay, so I'll stop here and we'll pick up part 2 with cultural coherence. Have a great day.